Hello, I am Jyotika. Welcome to Excelling Psychology. In today's class, we will revise topic 1 of AS level for AQA psychology, memory. In that, also, I am taking the specific subtopic of multi store model of memory. This lesson should be useful to both international Oxford AQA students as well as GCE AQA students who are within the UK because the topic is common to both curricula and the questions, the nature of the questions are those which can be asked in both types of papers. I think the best way to revise what you have learned is to test yourself on past paper questions to see whether you can answer those questions or not and meet the assessment objective requirements. Just reading and rereading is not enough for revision. Okay, so having said that, let's begin with the first question. As I guide you through the questions, I will give you advice on how you should write your answers. So we'll discuss the structure of the answers, how to meet various assessment objectives, as well as we will learn what content to cover within which answer. Let's look at the first question on the screen. The question is a very simple one for 1 mark. Suggest one way in which the working memory model might be a better explanation of short term memory than the multi store model. Now, I know immediately what must be coming to your mind, which is a correct point, that in the multi-store model, STM has been taken as a unitary construct or a single construct, as if there are no further subdivisions to it. Whereas the working memory model emphasizes on various subcomponents which are there within short-term memory. So definitely that is one point that can be given. Another point that can be given is that working memory model looks at short-term memory as an active process, as a workbench, as they refer to it. Whereas the multi-store model just looks at short-term memory as a passive store. It just receives information from the sensory register and then passes it on to long-term memory. We can give either of these points. In fact, there are many more points you can give. You could also speak about the different type of research that has been done. When it comes to working memory, there's better backing by more recent studies compared to the earlier studies which supported the Atkinson-Shiffrin concept of short-term memory. Whatever you choose to take when you're writing, you should know the structure of writing this answer has to be a very, very direct addressal of the question which is there. This is an entirely AO1 question, assessment objective 1, purely description. They just want you to write what you have learned from the textbook. They do not want to apply what you have learned to any example. So it is not an AO2 type of question. Neither is it AO3 because they haven't asked you for any strengths or weaknesses. So 1 mark is for AO1. You straight off have to write whichever point you want to make. Okay, so I will write a sample answer. You do not have to write this answer. This is just to show you how you can write or how you can phrase your answer. Okay, so we can simply write that and we can be direct. We don't need to write one way in which that way. We can straight off come to the point. Working memory model proposes that short-term memory is an active workbench rather than a passive store of information. So as simple as that. I have written a complete sentence, but you can see my focus is only on how it is an active workbench. I haven't tried to elaborate on what an active workbench is, or I haven't tried to propose how short-term memory processes information because it's just worth 1 mark. They do not require me to write more than this, and writing more than this would also be a waste of time. I wouldn't have enough time for the other questions. Okay, let's come to the second question now. Identify the main type of coding used in each of the following components of multi-store model of memory. One mistake students make here is to speak about capacity or duration rather than coding. So some students, it seems, they do not have clarity over the difference between duration, capacity and coding. So make sure your base concepts are clear to be able to answer these type of questions. As far as assessment objectives are concerned, this is again entirely AO1 targeted question, and I'm sure you can understand the breakup is very obvious in this. What you will write about short-term memory coding will give you 1 mark, and what you'll write about long-term memory coding will give you 1 mark. AO1 questions with command terms like identify and suggest just require that you give very direct answers. You just straight off come to the point. You can literally give 1-2 word answers also. That is perfectly acceptable, even if you don't write complete sentences. That is why you will see the space given is also very less, because that is also a cue for you that you mustn't write too much. As far as short-term memory coding is concerned, we know it is sound-based, it is acoustic. We have to use good terminology. So we have to say acoustic, acoustic. We cannot say that it is hearing based. Do not use casual language in any answer in the paper. When it comes to long-term memory, it is based on meaning, and the correct terminology is semantic. So we have to use the word semantic. Here literally I'm just going to answer in 2 words each. So the type of coding for short-term memory is acoustic coding, and the type of coding for long-term memory is semantic coding. That's all. That's all we need to write to get full 2 marks. Let's look at question 3. This is a little different. In an investigation into memory, participants were presented with 2 different lists of words. We can see the lists have been given. If you want, you can pause the video for a minute and just read the list. After seeing the list, participants were tested on their ability to recall the words. When tested immediately, participants found it difficult to recall the words from the list A in correct order. When tested after 30 minutes, participants found it more difficult to recall the words from list B in the correct order. Using your knowledge of, pay attention to this, coding in memory, explain these findings. Okay, let's see the marks. We must always check the marks before writing the answer. It's worth 4 marks. So this answer is worth 4 marks. Before I get into the assessment objectives for this, again I would like to highlight, look at what has been asked very carefully. Coding. Some students will again start thinking about capacity. So they will start thinking about how much information can be retained in short-term memory, like 7 plus or minus 2, whereas long-term memory has an infinite storage capacity. They've asked you for coding. If you're going to write about capacity, it's going to be marked as incorrect. Now coming to assessment objectives. When they have given you a situation like this was an experiment which was conducted, it's a context or a scenario that they're giving you. They're not asking you a question directly from the textbook. Rather, what they're expecting is whatever you've learned in the textbook, you should be able to apply to this scenario or context. That means this question is based on AO2, Assessment Objective 2, which is application. Undoubtedly, you will be using knowledge which you have learned in the textbook. You cannot do AO2 without referring to AO1. Just a minute. Okay, so sorry for the interruption. I was talking about how you have to use AO1, that what you've learned in the syllabus, you have to apply it to the scenario. But when you're writing this answer in which a context is given, you're expected to write every point contextualized. Whatever you've learned, you have to write it with reference to the scenario given, not in isolation. So this is an entirely AO2 question worth 4 marks. So all the points you're going to get for meeting AO2 objectives. So what in your mind you have to think whenever it's AO2? Contextualized answer. Some students who do understand the coding part, we have written also in the previous answer that short-term memory is acoustic and long-term memory is semantic. They would write it in the same way that we have written the previous answer, question 2. Then they don't get marks because they haven't applied it to the scenario. They have just written it as they learned in the textbook. So what we are going to do, as we know short-term memory is acoustic. Let's see in this situation how that acoustic coding of short-term memory is playing a role. They are telling us when it comes to list A, people are finding it difficult to immediately recall it in correct order. First of all, when they use the word immediately, that indicates that they are remembering from short-term memory. Because what we have learned in our syllabus is that as long as we keep on rehearsing information, it is maintained in short-term memory. So immediate recall will be coming from there. So now when we see that word immediately and we look at the list again, list A, we should think what must be happening from a short-term memory coding point of view from this list. So what we see is all the words are beginning with FL, the sound of FL. Also, many words are quite similar to each other. Flip, flit. There's just one syllable difference between these type of words. Since short-term memory is acoustic, it's based on sound, it is bound to get confused between words which sound similar to each other. That is why participants must be finding it difficult to remember list A. Then coming to list B, here the hint is they had to remember it after 30 minutes. If you're going to keep on rehearsing something in short-term memory for a few minutes, maybe the full 30 minutes, it will get transferred to long-term memory as we know. Maintenance or elaborative rehearsal, whatever they must be using, will take that information to long-term memory. Long-term memory is based on semantic encoding. So now we know when they're asking us about list B and they're telling us 30 minutes, it has to do with long-term memory. We've just written long-term memory has semantic coding. Now let's look at the list from that point of view. From a semantic coding point of view, why might it be difficult to remember? So if we look at the words huge, large, great, giant, all indicate the same thing. All have a similar, we won't say the same, but similar base meaning. They all are referring to some sort of size, big size, or we can say bigness. Not a very good word, but that way. They are just indicating, all of them are indicating that something is big or large that way. So they are very similar in meaning. That is why if a person is trying to remember these words in long-term memory, they are essentially encoding it in form of what they mean. So it's going to be confusing when all are meaning similar things. Okay, now let's see how to write this answer. It's not compulsory, but try to target 2 sentences for 2 marks for short-term memory coding and 2 sentences for 2 marks for long-term memory coding. Content is more important than counting the sentences or number of points you're making. There's no doubt about that. But what happens is if we don't say this explicitly to students that give 2 points or give 2 sentences, they'll just write 1 sentence, they won't elaborate enough and they don't get good marks. So as a benchmark, you can think of it that let me give 2 points or 2 sentences to justify 2 marks. Okay, how we can write the answer is list A contains words that sound similar. Since they are beginning with the sound FL. What I want you to note as I'm writing is I have directly referred to the context in the very first sentence itself. So I have not first explained what is acoustic coding or given any general point from the textbook about how short-term memory codes information. I have directly started applying to the scenario. That's how we begin an AO2 answer. And now to complete this point, I will write. Okay, one more thing is students just leave it at this. It sounds similar. So what? You have to complete. So what is the difficulty? Because they've asked us why it's more difficult to recall the words. So that we need to explain. Since coding in short-term memory is acoustic, and this list is being recalled immediately. It is difficult to recall. So I want you to see here why I will score good marks for this answer. I have used correct terms, good terminology like acoustic, short-term memory, coding, those type of words. Okay, I know for shorter answers, terminology is not emphasized in the mark scheme. It is emphasized for the longer answers, but does not mean that for shorter answers we don't pay attention to terminology. We have to. Secondly, I have, like I mentioned earlier, contextualized the answer. I have not written anything out of context or in isolation. I have referred to the scenario when I'm writing. Also, I'm very clear about which type of memory is being discussed. Instead of just saying acoustic coding, I've specified in short term memory, there's acoustic coding. Some points which I'm giving you might seem very obvious to you, but there are many students who overlook the obvious. That's why I'm specifying. Also, many students will make one more mistake, which is not saying why we are assuming that the list is in short term memory. Because recall is immediate. They have hinted at that. That's why we know it's in short term memory. Otherwise, if it was being asked after some time, like say after 30 minutes, the meaning of the words are different, though they sound similar. It would not be much of a challenge to remember if it was in long term memory. So we must mention because recall is immediate, it's in short term memory. That's why sounding similar is creating acoustic confusion. Means that is what we have to imply through these sentences. In the exam, you might not have that much time, but when you're practicing at home or in class, you have the time, and the purpose is to see that your answers are easily understandable. So after writing your answers, always read them once to yourself as if you were the examiner. Would the point be clear to you? Or is there something that you would have to ask questions to understand better? In that case, keep revising your writing style till you're able to put your points with great clarity. In the same way, we will complete the rest of the answer. List B contains words that have similar meaning. As they all indicate some type of big size, or you can say something to the effect of big size. Since coding in long term memory is semantic, and this list is being recalled after 30 minutes, it can be difficult to remember. I hope you're writing with me. Preferably, don't be lazy, don't just keep on seeing. In fact, the best approach would be pause the video, write your own answer, then cross check with mine and see my reasoning for why I have written that way. Then you'll be able to see where you are making mistakes. So, why your answers are not matching with mine, or maybe they are matching. It doesn't have to be exact, but they're covering all the ground that I'm covering. In that case, then you know how to write the answers well. So always write yourself first. That's the best way. Otherwise, if you just keep seeing how someone's writing or keep copying down those answers, you don't get much insight into your own mistakes, and then how will you rectify them? Okay, also before I forget, I will try to upload this document, how much ever I cover, on my website. And so if you need it for reference while you're watching this video, I will link the document in the description box below and in the pinned comment below. You can download it from there and then you can learn this lesson. Okay, just a minute, I'll be back. Okay, so let us look at the next question now. Outline what psychological research has shown about short term memory according to the multi store model of memory. This answer is for 4 marks. I think it's a very direct question. As you can see, they have asked you what research has shown. There is so much research that you have learned in terms of capacity of short-term memory duration. So you have learned Peterson and Peterson to see that it has about 18 seconds of duration. You have learned Miller's chunking concept, his research on chunking, to see that it can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items. Now let's discuss about the structure of the answer first. Definitely it is worth 4 marks entirely. You can see it's for 4 marks entirely on AO1, because you just have to write from the textbook. Again, no evaluation, so no AO3, and no context is given for application. So there's no AO2 either. What is more important in the structure is students will always ask me, should we cover 2 or 3 researches like to justify 4 marks, or should we take only one piece of research and just elaborate on that? It's up to you whether you want to take a depth approach or a breadth approach. If you're taking a depth approach, I would suggest you take one study, write the key points about it. Like, let's say you're taking Peterson and Peterson, you can include what task participants were made to do and how they came to the conclusion that the duration is 18 seconds. If you take a breadth approach, I would suggest not taking more than 2 pieces of research. Otherwise, for 4 marks, it becomes too much. And then you'll just be touching like one line on each, which will not really outline anything. The command term is outline, not just identify or just name. So just say, okay, Peterson did a research and Miller did another piece of research, not like that. They want you to outline, write a little bit about what was found in the research at least. So I would suggest, even if you're taking a breadth approach, just take only 2 pieces of research for 4 marks. I'm taking a breadth approach right now. I do take depth approach usually, especially for AO3, but for AO1 of this nature, I feel breadth is good. Now I'll tell you why. In our syllabus, if you see, you don't have to remember any of the studies in detail. So I know many of the students will not even know the names of the researchers who have found out about duration and capacity of memory, let alone what they did. So they know that what is the capacity and what is the duration, but they don't know what Peterson and Peterson did in the experiment or what Miller did in his experiment. So that's why, because most of the students are familiar with the final outcome of the experiments, I will write it in that way only. So I'm going to take 2 pieces of research, one referring to the capacity, the other one referring to the duration. I'm not going to name any of the researchers nor explain what they did in their research. I'm strictly going to talk about what the research showed, a little elaborately, to justify 2 marks for each point. Let's see how we can write this. I'll show you a sample of how we can write. Psychological research has shown that the capacity of short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. This is what research has shown. This is the exact finding I have written, but it is worth 2 marks. So I can give one more point for elaboration. Either I can just explain what we mean by 7 plus or minus 2, or I can just suggest anything about capacity, how it can be increased, or why it might be more or less for somebody. Right now, I'll just elaborate on the same point by explaining what it means. This means that an individual can hold anywhere between 9 uh, chunks or groups of information in this store. So one research I've given about capacity, and I've justified 2 marks by explaining exactly what it means. That's why I've said, as a rule of thumb, keep 2 sentences in your mind so that you don't end up giving a very short answer that does not justify 2 marks but only 1 mark, because then you'll get only 1 mark. Okay, I would like to give another research about duration. So it has also shown that the duration of short term memory is about 18 to 30 seconds. To elaborate on this, you can give an example from Peterson and Peterson, that if people are asked to remember something and rehearsal is prevented, then that information tends to fade away in 18 seconds. Other ways in which you can elaborate is by talking about the articulatory rehearsal loop, in which